I am Richard Caldwell, 68 years old, and a retired forensic accountant who spent decades hunting down corporate parasites. But the most dangerous parasite I ever encountered was sleeping in my twin brother's bed. Last Tuesday, my twin brother William called me weeping from a freezing parking lot because his wife drained his life savings to buy their spoiled son a luxury sports car, leaving William completely unable to pay for his vital heart medication. When I heard her laugh through the phone, I did not call the police or hire a lawyer. I bought a plane ticket, dyed my hair to match his exact shade of gray, and walked through her front door disguised as the husband she had systematically abused for 30 years. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to step in and destroy a bully who targeted someone you love. The phone rang at exactly 9 in the evening. The storm outside was violently lashing against the heavy glass windows of my warm, secure home. I picked up the receiver and heard only a ragged, wet breathing on the other end of the line. Then the trembling voice of my twin brother pierced through the static. William sounded like a frightened, abandoned child, not a 68-year-old retired high school teacher. He told me he was standing outside a neighborhood pharmacy in the middle of a freezing downpour. His voice shook so violently I could barely understand his words. He explained that his debit card had just been declined at the pharmacy counter. He desperately needed his prescription blood pressure and heart medication, the very pills that kept his fragile heart beating and prevented a fatal stroke. The pharmacist had looked at him with a mixture of pity and cold impatience. The terminal had flashed a notification of insufficient funds, a sudden and total depletion of a bank account William had spent 40 years building. William had stepped out into the freezing rain, his chest tight with panic, and dialed his wife. He called Patricia, begging for an explanation and pleading for help. He told me he had recorded the phone call because he could not believe what he was hearing. He played the recording for me over our open line. Through the crackling audio, I heard my brother pleading for the $70 needed to literally keep him alive. Then I heard Patricia speak. Her voice was sharp, entitled, and dripping with absolute disdain. She casually informed William that she had just emptied their joint checking account without his knowledge. She proudly announced that she had transferred every last cent to secure a down payment on a brand new Porsche for their 35-year-old son, Bradley. She claimed Bradley needed the luxury vehicle to project success, and that William was being incredibly selfish for worrying about his little pills. When William started to cry on the recording, Patricia laughed. It was a chilling, cruel laugh that echoed with decades of unchecked emotional abuse. She told her husband of 30 years to stop whining, ordered him to walk 3 miles home in the freezing rain, and promptly hung up the phone. Hearing that laugh ignited a terrifying cold fire deep inside my chest. The sheer audacity of her cruelty severed the final thread of my patience. The image of my twin brother, a man who had dedicated his entire life to educating children and providing for his family, shivering in the dark while his wife celebrated buying a sports car with his stolen money, was a reality I absolutely refused to accept. I immediately took command of the situation. I ordered William to stay exactly where he was under the pharmacy awning. I told him to stop crying and listen to my voice. I opened my laptop and instantly booked a private car service to pick him up from that miserable parking lot. I paid the driver triple his usual rate to ensure he arrived within 5 minutes and instructed him to turn the heater on maximum. As I secured the transport, my mind shifted into the clinical, ruthless gear I had cultivated over my 30-year career. I spent my professional life as a forensic accountant. I dismantled complex embezzlement rings, tracked hidden offshore funds, and destroyed arrogant executives who thought they were clever enough to steal without consequence. I viewed numbers as weapons and financial records as battlefields. William, on the other hand, had always been the gentle soul. He was the brother who rescued stray animals and forgave every insult. When he married Patricia 3 decades ago, I saw the warning signs. I saw her manipulative nature, her constant demands for expensive gifts, and her subtle ways of isolating him from his friends and family. I had tried to warn him, but William was blinded by a desperate desire for a peaceful family life. Over the years, she built a wall around him, cutting off our communication until we only spoke on holidays. But twin brothers share a bond that distance cannot erase. As I booked a first-class flight to his city for the very next morning, I realized that Patricia had made a fatal miscalculation. She had spent 30 years breaking down a gentle high school teacher, completely unaware that his twin brother made a living destroying monsters just like her. I packed my leather briefcase with my most advanced encrypted hard drives, digital recording devices, and a specialized keystroke logger. I was not going to visit my brother to offer a shoulder to cry on. I was launching a hostile takeover of his ruined life. I instructed the car service to take William directly to a secure upscale hotel near the airport far away from Patricia and her toxic house. I called the hotel concierge, provided my platinum credit card, and ordered them to bring William hot food and dry clothes the second he arrived. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my dark office staring at the rain, mapping out the preliminary stages of Patricia's absolute financial and social destruction. The next morning, the fluorescent lights of the airport terminal felt harsh and unforgiving. I stood near the arrival gate, scanning the crowd of exhausted travelers filtering out of the security checkpoint. I was looking for a man who shared my exact facial structure, my height, and my general build. But when William finally walked through the sliding glass doors, my breath caught in my throat. I almost did not recognize the man shuffling toward me. The physical devastation was shocking. William was not just older, he was hollowed out. His posture was severely hunched, his shoulders curling inward as if he were constantly anticipating a physical blow. His clothes hung loosely off his frail frame, indicating a severe and rapid weight loss. The tailored suits he used to wear with pride were replaced by a faded oversized jacket that offered no real protection against the cold. His cheekbones protruded sharply beneath his pale, bruised-looking skin. But the most horrifying detail was his eyes. The bright, intelligent spark that used to define my brother was completely extinguished. His eyes darted nervously around the bustling terminal, filled with a deep, paralyzing paranoia. He looked like a prisoner of war who had finally managed to escape, only to realize he no longer knew how to survive in the free world. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around his trembling shoulders. He collapsed against my chest, sobbing quietly into my coat. People stared, but I did not care. I guided him away from the crowds and into a quiet, secluded corner of the airport coffee shop. I bought him a hot tea and forced him to wrap his freezing hands around the ceramic mug. As he sat there struggling to form complete sentences, the true magnitude of Patricia's 30-year campaign of terror began to unfold. William confessed that the stolen bank account was only the final blow in a long, agonizing sequence of betrayals. He admitted that Patricia had slowly stripped his name off their valuable assets, diverted his pension into accounts he could not access, and routinely humiliated him in front of their son, Bradley. Bradley had grown into a cruel mirror image of his mother, treating his father like an annoying servant rather than a parent. William told me he had not eaten a hot meal in his own home for months, surviving on cheap snacks while Patricia and Bradley ordered lavish dinners. He looked down at his shaking hands and whispered that he wanted to hire a divorce lawyer, but he had absolutely no money left to pay a retainer. He said he was ready to give up, to just walk into the woods and disappear so he would not be a burden to anyone anymore. Hearing those words of utter defeat triggered a profound shift within my mind. I looked at the broken man sitting across from me and realized that standard legal channels were utterly useless in this scenario. A traditional divorce proceeding would take years of agonizing litigation. Patricia would hire aggressive lawyers using William's own stolen money. She would drag him through depositions, assassinate his character in court, and deliberately prolong the process until William's fragile heart finally gave out. She would win by simply outlasting his will to live. A lawsuit would be a death sentence for my brother. I reached across the table and gripped William's hand, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I told him he was not going to hire a lawyer, and he was not going back to that house of horrors. I told him I had a secluded mountain cabin hundreds of miles away, fully stocked and equipped with a private nurse who would ensure he received proper medical care, excellent food, and total peace. William blinked in confusion, asking who was going to deal with Patricia and the massive financial mess she had created. I let a cold, calculated smile touch my lips. I explained my plan with absolute clarity. We shared the same face, the same voice pitch, and the same DNA. The only difference was that William was a victim and I was a predator. I told my brother that he was going to disappear into the mountains to heal, and I was going to dye my hair, put on his oversized jacket, and walk through Patricia's front door. I was going to switch lives with him. I promised William that I would locate every single dollar she had stolen, expose every secret she had buried, and systematically dismantle her entire world from the inside out. I vowed to him right then and there that by the time I was finished, his wife and his spoiled son would beg for the very mercy they had violently denied him. The drive up the winding mountain road was completely silent. William stared blankly out the passenger window at the dense pine trees, his breathing shallow and uneven. I pulled my heavy steel SUV into the hidden driveway of my secluded cabin. This place was my fortress, built entirely off the grid and fully equipped for long stretches of isolation. I had already made the necessary arrangements during our flight. Standing on the wooden porch waiting for us was Nurse Collins. She was a retired military medic I had retained years ago for high-security corporate extractions. She did not ask unnecessary questions. She only followed explicit orders. I helped my fragile brother out of the vehicle and handed Nurse Collins a thick envelope containing enough cash to cover 6 months of round-the-clock medical care. I gave her my demands. William was to be fed highly nutritious meals, monitored constantly for any signs of sudden cardiac distress, and kept completely disconnected from the outside world. There would be no television, no internet access, and absolutely no phone calls. I watched as Nurse Collins gently guided my weeping brother into the warm, brightly lit cabin. The heavy oak door closed, locking him safely away from the nightmare he had endured for 30 years. My brother was finally safe. Now, my real work had to begin. I walked into the master bathroom and locked the heavy door behind me. I stood under the harsh vanity lights and stared directly at my reflection in the wide mirror. We shared the exact same bone structure, the same square jaw, and the same pale blue eyes. But time and circumstance had carved completely different maps on our faces. My skin was weathered from competitive sailing and outdoor living, while William carried the pale, sickly pallor of a man who lived entirely in the dark shadows of his own home. I opened the chemical supplies I had purchased on the way to the airport terminal. I began the meticulous process of erasing my own identity. I applied a specialized chemical dye to my thick silver hair, dulling the vibrant shine and matching the exact uneven graying pattern William possessed. I used theatrical-grade cosmetics to artificially deepen the dark bags under my eyes and hollow out my cheeks, simulating the severe malnutrition I had witnessed earlier. I stripped off my tailored cashmere sweater and expensive leather shoes. I picked up the faded oversized jacket William had left on the passenger seat. As I slipped my arms into the worn fabric, I could literally smell the stale fear clinging to the frayed collar. The cosmetic changes were surprisingly simple. The physical performance would be the true challenge of this operation. I spent the next 4 hours walking back and forth across the hardwood floor, ruthlessly breaking down my own natural body language. I am a man who enters a room and commands immediate, unquestioned attention. I stand straight, I keep my shoulders pulled back, and I meet every single gaze with unyielding authority. To become William, I had to completely dismantle my pride. I forced my rigid spine to curve forward into a permanent defeated hunch. I rolled my shoulders inward, deliberately minimizing my physical presence to appear small and completely non-threatening to anyone observing me. I practiced keeping my eyes focused firmly on the floorboards, only looking up with rapid, nervous, fluttering glances. Then I began to fiercely work on my voice. My natural speaking tone is deep, clear, and highly resonant. I spent 2 solid hours speaking to the empty room, forcing my vocal cords to tighten painfully. I practiced a slight, pathetic tremor in my words, raising the pitch until I sounded exactly like the terrified man who had begged for his heart medication in the freezing rain. I walked back to the mirror and stared at the final result. Richard Caldwell was completely gone. Looking back at me was the hollow, broken shell of William Caldwell. The transformation was practically flawless, but maintaining this illusion would require absolute mental discipline. If I stood too tall for even a single second, or if my voice carried a tiny hint of natural strength, Patricia would instantly know she was dealing with a dangerous imposter. I packed a small duffel bag with only the bare essentials. I walked out of the bathroom and paused by the guest room door, listening to the steady, rhythmic beeping of the expensive heart monitor attached to my sleeping brother. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the cabin, got back into my vehicle, and pointed the bright headlights down the steep mountain. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a bitter, biting cold. I merged onto the interstate highway, heading directly toward the wealthy suburbs. I was about to willingly walk into a psychological slaughterhouse. I mentally locked away my cold fury, replacing it with the manufactured terror of a severely abused husband. I parked my vehicle 3 blocks away from the sprawling suburban colonial house to avoid any suspicion from the neighbors. I pulled the collar of William's oversized faded jacket up against the bitter winter wind and began the long walk toward the property. Every step I took was a highly calculated exercise in physical submission. I forced my heavy leather boots to drag slightly against the concrete pavement. I mentally reviewed the layout of the property from the detailed architectural sketches William had drawn for me on the airplane. The perfectly manicured lawn, the expensive custom landscaping, and the grand double front doors were entirely funded by my brother's stolen pension and ruined credit. I reached the front porch and pulled the heavy brass key from my coat pocket. My natural instinct was to grip the cold metal firmly and stride inside, but I forced my fingers to tremble violently. I inserted the key, turned the deadbolt, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The immediate blast of warm indoor air was suffocating, thick with the overpowering scent of expensive floral perfume and burning cedar firewood. I stepped into the grand foyer and carefully closed the door behind me, making sure not to slam it. I kept my chin tucked down deeply into my chest, staring intently at the polished marble floor. I heard the sharp, rhythmic tapping of designer heels approaching from the main hallway. Patricia walked into the foyer holding a crystal wine glass in one hand and a glowing digital tablet in the other. She did not even bother to look at my face. She simply glanced down at my wet shoes and let out a dramatic theatrical sigh of absolute disgust. She wore a silk designer dressing gown that cost more than the emergency medical treatment William had desperately needed just hours ago. She stopped a few feet away from me, radiating a toxic aura of absolute entitlement and petty cruelty. I waited for her to speak, keeping my breathing deliberately shallow and erratic to flawlessly mimic my brother's constant state of panic. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was a precision weapon designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She asked me where I had been, but she absolutely did not wait for an answer. She told me I was a pathetic burden who could not even manage a simple trip to the local pharmacy without causing an embarrassing scene for the family. Every single word she spoke was forcefully laced with a venomous condescension that made my muscles coil with the primal instinct to strike. The conflict raging inside my mind was deafening and physically painful. I have spent my entire adult life destroying arrogant corporate thieves who thought they were untouchable by the law. Standing in that bright foyer looking at the monster who had systematically tortured my gentle twin brother for 30 years, every fiber of my being wanted to stand up straight. I desperately wanted to drop the frail act, look her dead in the eyes, and tell her exactly who I was and what I was about to do to her comfortable life. But I knew that revealing myself now would instantly ruin the entire covert operation. A swift physical or verbal confrontation would offer a brief moment of immense satisfaction, but it would absolutely not secure the stolen financial assets or put her behind federal bars. I had to swallow my roaring pride and fully embrace the sickening humiliation. I swallowed hard, forcing a pathetic, trembling whimper into my throat and apologized to her for being late. Hearing my own strong voice sound so incredibly weak and broken made me feel physically ill. Patricia simply sneered at my genuine-sounding apology. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the small puddles of rainwater dripping from my boots onto her pristine white marble floor. She declared that I had ruined her peaceful evening with my sheer incompetence, and now I was ruining her beautiful home with my street filth. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume barely masking the smell of her rotten soul, and loudly ordered me to clean the floor immediately. She did not tell me to get a standard mop. She specifically commanded me to go to the utility closet, fetch a bucket of freezing cold water, and a coarse yellow sponge and scrub the entire foyer and massive kitchen floor on my hands and knees. She cruelly stated that hard physical labor was the only way I could possibly earn my keep in her house, since my bank accounts were now completely empty and useless. The sheer breathtaking audacity of her demand almost broke my iron concentration. She was standing in a massive house paid for entirely by William, drinking expensive wine bought with William's stolen money, and commanding me to scrub the floor like an indentured servant. I gave her a tiny, deeply submissive nod. I shuffled slowly past her, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the wooden baseboards, and made my way down the hall to the utility closet. I found the heavy plastic bucket and the abrasive sponge. I filled the bucket with water, letting the loud sound of the rushing faucet temporarily drown out the violent pounding of my angry heart. I carried the sloshing bucket back to the foyer and slowly lowered my body onto my knees. The cold marble sent a sharp, biting ache through my older joints, but the physical discomfort was absolutely nothing compared to the immense psychological strain of the theatrical performance. I plunged the sponge into the freezing water, wrung it out with shaking hands, and began to aggressively scrub the dirty floor tiles. Patricia absolutely did not leave the room to let me work in peace. She stood directly over me, taking slow, deliberate sips of her expensive red wine, watching me demean myself for her personal entertainment. She began to casually narrate my perceived lifelong failures. She told me I had always been a terrible provider, a completely weak husband, and a profoundly useless father to Bradley. She boldly claimed that emptying my retirement account was actually a massive favor because I was clearly too incompetent to manage our complex family finances. With every single painful swipe of the wet sponge against the hard floor, I mentally cataloged her growing list of crimes. I memorized the exact cadence of her cruel laughter and the precise phrasing of her daily insults. I was not just scrubbing a dirty floor in the suburbs. I was building a comprehensive psychological profile of my primary target. I was actively gathering the necessary emotional fuel to ensure that when I finally dropped the legal guillotine on her fraudulent life, I would not feel a single microscopic ounce of human mercy. My lower back began to spasm violently from continuously maintaining the unnatural hunched posture. I desperately wanted to stretch my spine to roll my broad shoulders back and relieve the mounting physical pressure, but I remained firmly locked in my pathetic groveling position. I moved slowly on my bruised knees from the bright foyer into the massive custom-designed kitchen. The countertops were imported black granite, the appliances were industrial-grade stainless steel, and the custom oak cabinetry stretched all the way up to the vaulted ceiling. It was a towering monument to unchecked greed built entirely upon the shattered foundation of my twin brother's ruined life. Patricia followed me directly into the kitchen, leaning casually against the massive center island. She complained loudly that I was moving much too slowly and that my pathetic, ragged breathing was giving her a terrible headache. I kept my head down, moving the abrasive sponge in rhythmic, endless circles, breathing in the sharp scent of chemical lemon cleaner and decades of old resentments. I realized in that exact moment that Patricia was not a criminal mastermind. She was simply a brutal, opportunistic bully who had taken severe advantage of a deeply kind and forgiving man. She possessed no real intellectual cunning, only a vicious reptilian instinct fueled by her unchecked narcissism. She felt so completely and utterly safe in her total dominance that she did not even bother to properly observe the man currently kneeling on her kitchen floor. If she had bothered to look closely, she would have clearly noticed that my large hands did not tremble at all as I forcefully squeezed the heavy sponge. She would have seen that my shoulders under the oversized jacket were wide and dense, with thick muscle not wasted away from severe malnutrition and chronic fear. She would have instantly recognized the cold, predatory calculation burning brightly behind my pale blue eyes. But she saw only exactly what she fully expected to see. She saw her helpless, broken victim. I scrubbed my way painfully across the expensive kitchen floor, moving inch by inch closer to the massive oak cabinetry located directly under the center island. I quietly accepted the sharp pain radiating through my knees and the deep burning sensation in my lower back. I silently accepted the bitter humiliation of her cruel, endless words washing over my bowed head. I actively welcomed the extreme degradation because it conclusively confirmed everything I needed to know about the enemy in front of me. The relentless psychological abuse she casually hurled at me was the absolute, undeniable proof that she deeply deserved the complete and utter financial devastation I was meticulously preparing to unleash upon her. I moved my dripping wet sponge purposefully along the bottom base of the heavy kitchen island, pushing my body deep into the dark shadows where her arrogant, dismissive gaze could not possibly follow me, silently and eagerly preparing for the exact next phase of my invisible, impending war. I pushed the heavy sponge deeper into the dark recess beneath the massive oak overhang of the kitchen island. The abrasive chemical cleaner burned my raw knuckles, but I welcomed the sharp sting to keep my mind entirely focused. Patricia finally grew bored of watching my pathetic display. Her digital tablet chimed with an incoming notification, and her cruel attention instantly shifted away from my bowed head. She muttered a final insult about my complete lack of ambition and turned her back and walked toward the formal dining room. The rhythmic tapping of her designer heels slowly faded into the distance. For the first time since I entered this hostile environment, I was completely unobserved. My breathing immediately slowed down. I allowed the fabricated tremor in my hands to completely vanish. My muscles, coiled tight from the extreme physical suppression of my true nature, finally relaxed by a fraction of an inch. I was alone in the enemy territory. My forensic instincts instantly flared to life. 30 years of hunting corporate criminals had trained my eyes and hands to find the subtle anomalies that arrogant thieves always leave behind. Arrogant people believe they are smarter than everyone else, which makes them incredibly predictable. I knew Patricia was hiding the physical proof of her complex financial crimes somewhere in this sprawling house. She was far too controlling to trust a remote storage facility or a secure bank deposit box that she could not monitor daily. The hard evidence had to be close to her at all times. I ran my bare fingers along the intricate wooden trim at the base of the heavy island. I traced the perfectly aligned grout lines of the expensive floor tiles, hidden entirely from the casual observer. The area beneath the counter was deeply shadowed. It was a dead zone designed purely for structural support. Most people would only run a wet mop blindly through this dark space. But I pressed my palm flat against the cold marble and dragged it slowly across the surface, feeling for any microscopic shift in elevation or texture. My fingertips suddenly snagged on a tiny imperfection. It was a hairline fracture in the otherwise flawless grout located in the absolute darkest corner where the heavy oak cabinetry met the floor. I shifted my weight off my bruised knees and leaned closer completely, ignoring the painful spasms shooting up my lower back. I pressed my shoulder against the cabinet door and aimed the small flashlight of my digital watch directly at the floor. The hairline fracture was not a simple mistake made by the wealthy contractors. It was a perfectly straight and deliberate cut, forming a tight square exactly the size of a standard legal document folder. My heart rate remained completely steady, but a cold surge of absolute predatory triumph washed through my veins. I pulled a thin metal pry tool from the hidden seam of my worn jacket. I slipped the edge of the tool into the microscopic gap and applied a gentle, calculated pressure. The square tile did not pop up. Instead, it slid silently to the left on a concealed magnetic track. The heavy marble tile glided away, revealing the dark steel face of a high-security floor safe deeply embedded into the concrete foundation. I stared at the matte black metal and instantly recognized the specific manufacturer. It was a commercial-grade depository safe. It was the exact model favored by paranoid corporate embezzlers who needed to protect physical ledgers and unauthorized bank drafts. This was not a simple lockbox for expensive jewelry or old family heirlooms. This was a subterranean vault designed specifically to hide severe financial felonies. I knew with absolute certainty what rested inside that cold steel box. Patricia would never leave the forged secondary mortgage documents or the routing numbers for her secret offshore accounts in a standard filing cabinet. She kept the absolute blueprint of the financial execution of my brother locked directly beneath the very floor he walked on every single day. The sheer poetic cruelty of placing the safe under the kitchen island where she regularly forced him to grovel and scrub was a testament to her sick psychological dominance. I carefully ran my thumb over the digital keypad resting flush against the steel door. The buttons were completely smooth and wiped clean of any residual fingerprints. I pushed the heavy marble tile back into its original position and watched it lock into place with a soft magnetic click. The seam vanished entirely. I plunged my hands back into the freezing bucket of dirty water and resumed my pathetic hunched posture just as Patricia began walking back down the main hallway. I had successfully located the exact beating heart of her entire criminal operation. But the discovery instantly birthed a massive and terrifying new conflict. I desperately needed the 6-digit combination to that steel vault. I could not use industrial tools to drill the lock because the deafening noise and the physical damage would immediately alert Patricia to my true identity. I could not hire a professional safecracker to enter the house because Patricia rarely left the property and monitored the external security cameras obsessively. And I absolutely could not ask her or her spoiled son for the numbers without instantly blowing my fragile cover and destroying the entire mission. If she suspected for a single second that her helpless husband suddenly knew about the hidden vault, she would immediately empty the contents and execute her exit strategy before I could build the federal case. I kept my head down and scrubbed the floor while my mind raced through 1,000 tactical permutations. I had the exact location of the weapon that would completely destroy her life. But I was locked out while the clock rapidly ticked toward total financial ruin, and I had absolutely no idea how to force the devil to hand me her keys. The heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the hallway just as I finished wringing out the dirty sponge for the final time. I slowly pushed myself up from the cold marble floor, my joints screaming in protest, and adopted the deeply hunched posture of my broken twin brother. Patricia was already walking past me, completely ignoring my physical presence, her face transformed from a mask of cruel disdain into a beaming smile of maternal devotion. She pulled the heavy door open to welcome her son and his wife. Bradley walked into the foyer carrying himself with the unearned arrogance of a man who had never faced a single genuine consequence in his entire life. He wore a tailored Italian suit that hugged his shoulders perfectly and a gold watch that caught the light of the crystal chandelier. Monica followed closely behind him, wrapped in a designer cashmere coat, clutching a leather handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. They were the absolute picture of modern suburban success, a carefully curated illusion entirely funded by the systematic financial destruction of the man they believed was standing silently in the corner. I kept my chin tucked down, observing them through the gray strands of my dyed hair. Bradley did not greet me. He simply handed his wet overcoat to his mother, stepped right over the damp section of the floor I had just scrubbed, and walked directly into the formal dining room. Monica offered me a brief, disgusted glance, her nose crinkling as if the mere sight of my worn jacket offended her delicate sensibilities. She linked her arm through her husband's and followed him, loudly complimenting Patricia on the magnificent aroma filling the house. I remained in the foyer for a long moment, absorbing the sheer level of disrespect casually displayed by my own nephew. This was not a family gathering. This was a gathering of parasites preparing to feast on the remaining lifeblood of their chosen host. I shuffled slowly into the dining room, mentally preparing myself for the next phase of the psychological torture. The large mahogany table was elegantly set for 3 people. Fine china plates rested on expensive linen placemats accompanied by polished silver cutlery and tall crystal wine glasses. In the center of the table sat a massive silver platter holding 3 thick, perfectly seared prime ribeye steaks surrounded by roasted asparagus and buttered fingerling potatoes. The rich, savory smell of the expensive meat made my stomach twist, a sharp reminder of the physical hunger my brother endured on a daily basis. Patricia cheerfully directed Bradley and Monica to take their seats at the head of the table. She opened a bottle of imported French wine and generously filled their glasses, laughing brightly at a hollow joke Bradley made about his golf handicap. I stood awkwardly near the doorway, waiting for my instruction. Patricia finally turned her head and looked at me, her smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. She pointed toward a small, scratched wooden stool tucked away in the darkest corner of the kitchen, far away from the formal dining area. She told me my dinner was waiting for me on the counter. I walked over to the designated spot. Resting on the cold granite surface was a cheap cardboard tray containing a frozen microwave meal. The plastic film was peeled back, revealing a gray, watery block of processed meat and a small scoop of dehydrated mashed potatoes. There was no plate, no silverware, only a flimsy plastic fork resting on a single paper napkin. The message was brutally clear. I was not a member of this family. I was a tolerated pest allowed to consume the bare minimum calories required to keep me alive and compliant. I sat down on the hard wooden stool and picked up the plastic fork. I pierced the soggy, tasteless food and brought it to my mouth, forcing myself to swallow the bitter humiliation. From my dark corner, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the dining room table. I watched as Bradley cut effortlessly into his thick, juicy steak, chewing loudly while he dominated the conversation. He began to boast about the brand-new luxury sports car sitting in the driveway, the very same vehicle purchased with the stolen funds that left my brother unable to afford his heart medication. Bradley laughed as he described the custom leather interior and the upgraded sound system, casually mentioning that the monthly insurance premium was ridiculously high. Monica took a delicate sip of her expensive wine and chimed in, complaining that her current diamond tennis bracelet felt slightly outdated and she desperately needed an upgrade before their upcoming vacation to the Bahamas. Patricia eagerly nodded along, assuring her daughter-in-law that they would arrange a special shopping trip the very next weekend. My forensic accountant instincts automatically tallied the cost of their conversation. I was listening to them openly plan their next lavish expenditures using William's completely drained pension accounts. They spoke about his hard-earned money as if it were a natural, infinite resource that they inherently owned. At one point, Bradley paused his chewing, leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, and looked directly across the room at me. He raised his wine glass in a mocking toast. He thanked me for being such a quiet, undemanding roommate, stating that it was highly convenient that I required so little financial maintenance these days. Monica giggled behind her linen napkin, adding that it was truly a blessing that I had finally learned to stay out of their way. The sheer concentrated cruelty of their shared laughter echoed off the high ceilings, settling like a heavy stone in the center of my chest. I did not break my character. I gave my nephew a pathetic, trembling nod and lowered my eyes back to my cardboard tray, continuing to eat the terrible food in total silence. But beneath my perfectly constructed facade of a broken, defeated old man, my mind was operating with the cold, lethal precision of a hunting predator. This dinner was a profound revelation. Before I walked into this house, I had assumed that Patricia was the sole architect of William's misery, manipulating a passive or ignorant son. But watching Bradley actively participate in the emotional abuse, seeing the undeniable gleam of greedy entitlement in his eyes, I realized the absolute truth. Bradley and Monica were not innocent bystanders. They were fully willing, active accomplices in the systematic financial and psychological execution of my twin brother. They knew exactly where the money came from, and they felt absolutely zero remorse for the devastating toll it took on the man who had given them life. They were all entirely guilty. I scraped the last piece of cold food from the plastic tray, the bitter taste grounding my resolve. I silently promised the three monsters sitting in the warm, brightly lit dining room that they would soon experience a hunger far deeper than anything my brother had ever known. They would soon discover what it feels like to have every comfort, every dollar, and every shred of their false dignity ripped away in the blink of an eye. I stood up from the small wooden stool, carrying my empty cardboard tray toward the kitchen trash can, perfectly ready to execute the midnight digital operation that would serve as the first nail in their collective coffin. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway struck 2 in the morning. The heavy brass chimes vibrated through the cold floorboards of the cramped basement room where Patricia had permanently banished my brother. I sat on the edge of the narrow, uncomfortable cot in the absolute pitch black. I had not slept a single minute since the humiliating dinner concluded. I was waiting patiently for the sprawling suburban house to settle into complete and total silence. I reached into the deep inner pocket of my worn jacket and pulled out a small metallic object no larger than a standard house key. It was a military-grade hardware keystroke logger. I had utilized these exact covert devices during high-stakes corporate espionage investigations to completely dismantle corrupt executives. Once physically plugged into a computer port, this tiny piece of hardware would silently record every single letter, number, and password typed on the keyboard. It was designed to bypass all encrypted software firewalls completely undetected by the operating system. But to plant the device, I had to physically access Patricia's personal laptop. And I knew from William's desperate intelligence gathering that her laptop never left the master bedroom on the second floor. I stood up from the creaking metal cot and took a slow, deep breath of the damp basement air. The pathetic performance of the frail, broken husband was over for the night. I rolled my broad shoulders back, stretching the incredibly tight muscles in my lower spine, and allowed my natural physical strength to return to my limbs. I slipped off my heavy boots and walked in my thick socks toward the wooden basement stairs. Every single step I took was a highly calculated tactical movement. I placed the outer edge of my foot down first, rolling my body weight silently across the wooden planks to completely avoid the center where the boards were most likely to groan under pressure. I crept up the basement stairs and eased the door open into the main hallway. The house was freezing cold and suffocatingly still. The only sound masking my movements was the low, steady hum of the massive central heating unit pushing warm air exclusively to the upper floors. I moved like a ghost through the dark kitchen, passing the exact spot where I had scrubbed the floor on my bruised knees hours earlier. I looked down at the invisible seam hiding the heavy floor safe located directly beneath the center island. I knew with absolute certainty that the physical answers I desperately needed were locked inside that steel box, and the digital key to that subterranean vault was sitting upstairs on her hard drive. I approached the grand, sweeping mahogany staircase leading to the second floor. This was the most dangerous physical phase of the infiltration. I knew from my brother's incredibly detailed architectural sketches that the third step and the seventh step had loose nails that screeched loudly under any significant pressure. I carefully stepped completely over the third stair, stretching my long legs in the dark. I bypassed the seventh step, my heart beating with a steady, rigorously controlled rhythm. I was not a terrified victim sneaking around his own home. I was a veteran forensic predator maneuvering confidently through hostile enemy territory. I reached the second floor landing without making a single sound. The thick plush carpet instantly muffled my footsteps completely. I walked down the long, wide corridor toward the master bedroom. The heavy oak door was closed but not locked. Patricia felt too incredibly arrogant and too secure in her absolute psychological dominance to bother locking her bedroom door against the man she believed was cowering in the basement. I reached out and gripped the cold brass doorknob. I applied a slow, perfectly even pressure, turning the metal with excruciating care to prevent the internal latch from clicking audibly. I pushed the heavy door open just enough to slip my broad shoulders through the narrow gap. The master bedroom was massive and overwhelmingly opulent. Pale moonlight filtered softly through the sheer imported curtains, casting long pale shadows across the expensive custom furniture. In the center of the spacious room sat a gigantic king-sized bed purchased entirely with my brother's drained pension funds. Patricia lay directly in the middle of the massive mattress wrapped tightly in thick silk sheets. Her breathing was deep, heavy, and rhythmic. She slept with the profound, undisturbed peace of a wealthy woman who possessed absolutely no human conscience. I stood perfectly still just inside the doorway for 2 full minutes, allowing my eyes to completely adjust to the darkness and synchronizing my own breathing with the deep rise and fall of her chest. If she woke up right now and saw me standing tall and physically imposing in the dark, the entire covert operation would be instantly destroyed. She would scream loudly, the local police would be called immediately, and she would rapidly liquidate the hidden financial assets before I could build my airtight federal case. The physical risk was massive, but the impending reward of absolute justice pushed me forward. I scanned the dark room and quickly spotted my target. Sitting on a sleek glass vanity desk near the large bay windows was her expensive silver laptop. The metallic lid was closed. I moved silently across the plush carpet, placing my feet with agonizing slowness. Every single fiber of my being was hyper-aware of the sleeping monster resting less than 10 feet away from me. I reached the glass desk and gently pulled the keystroke logger from my pocket. I ran my bare fingertips delicately along the cold metal edge of the laptop, locating the small universal serial bus port on the back right corner. I positioned the small device perfectly, ensuring the internal metal prongs were properly aligned in the dark. I held my breath completely and pushed the hardware logger firmly into the open port. A tiny microscopic green light flashed once on the end of the device, instantly confirming it was receiving hidden power from the laptop battery. The digital trap was successfully installed. But as I carefully pulled my hand away from the machine, my knuckle lightly grazed a heavy crystal perfume bottle sitting carelessly on the glass desk. The thick glass bottle wobbled slightly, making a sharp, highly distinct clinking sound against the vanity surface. The sudden sound was utterly deafening in the silent room. On the massive bed, Patricia suddenly gasped loudly. The steady, rhythmic breathing stopped entirely. I clearly heard the loud rustle of the heavy silk sheets as she rapidly shifted her weight. I froze completely. I did not breathe. I did not blink. I stood as rigid as a carved stone statue in the dark shadows right next to the desk. I watched her dark silhouette rise slightly from the mattress. She muttered something totally incoherent in the dark, a sharp tone of intense annoyance lacing her sleep-heavy voice. My muscles coiled tight with an intense rush of pure adrenaline. If she reached over and turned on the bright bedside lamp, I would have less than 3 seconds to neutralize the dangerous situation without causing physical harm, a chaotic scenario that would ruin everything I had worked for. I waited in the agonizing, suffocating silence, my heart pounding a furious rhythm directly against my ribs. 10 seconds passed in the dark, then 20 long seconds. Finally, Patricia let out a long, heavy sigh of frustration. She rolled over roughly onto her side, turning her back completely to the glass vanity, and pulled the silk sheets aggressively up over her head. Her breathing slowly returned to a deep, even, and ignorant rhythm. The immediate, terrifying danger had finally passed. I exhaled the stale, burning air from my lungs with extreme care. I looked down one last time at the silver laptop resting on the desk. The tiny metallic device was perfectly concealed, acting as a silent digital parasite securely attached to the very center of her fraudulent world. Every single time she logged into her hidden bank accounts, every single time she sent a secret email to her offshore lover, and every single time she typed the 6-digit combination to the heavy floor safe downstairs, I would capture the exact data. The invisible guillotine was now fully armed and waiting for her to pull the lever. I turned away from the desk and began the slow, agonizingly careful retreat out of the master bedroom, mentally preparing myself to descend back into the freezing dark basement and wait for the digital harvest to begin. I descended the wooden stairs into the freezing basement, the suffocating tension of the master bedroom slowly draining from my rigid muscles. The pale, weak rays of early morning sunlight were just beginning to filter through the single dirty window near the ceiling, casting long gray shadows across the concrete floor. I did not waste a single second attempting to sleep. I opened my heavily encrypted leather briefcase and pulled out my modified field laptop, placing it quietly on the narrow metal cot. The hardware device I had successfully planted upstairs on Patricia's computer was equipped with a highly advanced microtransmitter. It was silently broadcasting its harvested digital data directly to my secure local network, bypassing the standard home router completely. I watched the black screen illuminate with endless lines of raw green text. It was a chaotic, rapid stream of every single keystroke Patricia had made since the moment she woke up earlier that week. I typed a rapid, complex sequence of commands running a proprietary sorting algorithm I had personally coded during my decades of dismantling massive corporate fraud rings. The algorithm instantly filtered out her meaningless internet searches for expensive jewelry and her useless social media gossip, isolating the highly specific numerical strings, hidden passwords, and secure web addresses I desperately needed. I sat in the absolute silence of the damp basement, my mind shifting entirely into the cold, ruthless, and analytical state of a forensic hunter. The disorganized numbers began to perfectly align on my screen, forming a dark, highly detailed, and undeniable map of her absolute financial treachery. The first massive anomaly surfaced within 20 minutes of running the diagnostic sweep. My algorithm successfully isolated a highly secure login sequence for a prominent national bank, a financial institution William had explicitly told me he never used during their entire 30-year marriage. I activated a military-grade virtual private network to completely mask my digital footprint and carefully entered her stolen credentials. The screen refreshed, revealing a massive, heavily leveraged secondary mortgage taken out directly against the sprawling suburban house. I pulled up the digitized loan documents and zoomed in closely on the primary signature line. Staring back at me from the glowing screen was a surprisingly accurate forgery of my twin brother's handwriting. But 30 years of analyzing fraudulent corporate ledgers and forged executive documents allowed me to immediately spot the microscopic hesitations in the pen strokes. Patricia had clearly practiced his signature relentlessly, but she entirely lacked the natural fluidity of a man simply writing his own name. She had secretly leveraged the entire equity of the pristine property, pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars in pure cash out of the house, while leaving William completely and solely legally responsible for the massive, crushing debt. But the sheer volume of the stolen cash sitting in the loan ledger did not match her current visible spending habits. The luxury sports car for Bradley and the expensive steak dinners were merely a shallow smokescreen. They were a tiny fraction of the total stolen amount, designed to hide a much larger, far more sinister financial maneuver operating deep in the shadows. I aggressively dug deeper into the intercepted keystrokes, tracing the hidden digital flow of the missing mortgage funds. I quickly uncovered a complex series of secure international wire transfers buried beneath thick layers of dummy shell company routing numbers. The massive sums of money were bleeding rapidly out of the country, funneling directly into a highly private numbered account located in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the offshore destination account with a series of hidden email drafts Patricia had typed and immediately deleted. She was using the draft folder of a secondary email address as a secure communication channel, a common tactic used by amateurs to avoid sending traceable permanent messages. I decrypted and read the recovered text, feeling a profound icy wave of absolute disgust wash over my entire body. The messages were addressed to a man named Vincent, a local luxury real estate broker I instantly recognized from William's extensive background notes. Patricia was not just stealing my brother's money to generously fund her own lavish, entitled lifestyle. She was actively and systematically liquidating his entire life to completely fund a permanent wealthy escape with her secret lover. The recovered messages detailed a highly coordinated, incredibly vicious plan to deliberately default on the massive secondary mortgage. Her ultimate goal was to let the bank aggressively repossess the family house, pack her bags in the middle of the night, and flee to a luxury tropical resort with the offshore millions. She planned to leave William literally homeless, completely penniless, and drowning in inescapable fraudulent debt. She had weaponized his profound, gentle trust to build her perfect, wealthy getaway vehicle. The heavy, aggressive thud of footsteps on the floorboards directly above my head abruptly pulled me away from the glowing screen. Morning had officially arrived in the House of Horrors, and my daily humiliating performance as the broken, abused husband had to resume immediately. I rapidly locked down my laptop, secured it deeply inside the hidden briefcase, and shuffled slowly up the basement stairs to prepare her morning coffee. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy brass mail slot on the front door clattered loudly, echoing through the grand foyer. I walked out of the kitchen, instinctively keeping my broad shoulders hunched and my eyes fixed firmly on the polished marble floor. Resting squarely on the pristine tile was a thick registered envelope from the exact national bank I had just investigated. The bold red letters stamped violently across the front of the envelope clearly indicated a final notice of foreclosure. I slowly reached down to pick it up, maintaining my deliberate trembling charade, but before my fingers could even brush the heavy paper, Patricia lunged aggressively past me. She snatched the thick envelope directly out of my hand, her face suddenly flushing with an intense, barely concealed panic. She shoved the bank notice violently into the deep pocket of her silk morning robe and screamed loudly at me to get back into the kitchen and stop spying on her personal mail. She hurled a vicious insult about my pathetic uselessness, completely unaware that I already knew exactly what was printed on those hidden pages. I lowered my head and shuffled away subserviently, but the final devastating piece of the puzzle had firmly snapped into place. The bank was already initiating the aggressive legal foreclosure process. Patricia was actively accelerating her exit timeline, preparing to run with Vincent and the stolen millions. The ultimate trap was closing incredibly fast, and I realized with absolute terrifying certainty that I had less than 30 days to completely dismantle her 30-year criminal empire before my brother lost everything he had ever built. The very next morning, the atmosphere inside the sprawling suburban house was incredibly toxic. Patricia was operating on a dangerous, manic energy fueled entirely by the bank foreclosure notice currently sitting in her pocket. She paced the hardwood floors like a caged predator, aggressively preparing to strike. I was standing in the cramped laundry room washing a heavy load of towels when she suddenly kicked the door open. She stood in the narrow doorway with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at me with a level of absolute disgust that made my blood run instantly cold. She loudly announced that the household finances were suddenly very tight and she was no longer willing to completely support a useless parasite. It was a spectacular display of psychological projection. The woman who had just secretly mortgaged the entire property to fund a permanent tropical escape with her real estate lover was now violently blaming her victim for the impending financial collapse. She demanded that I start contributing to the daily expenses immediately. I kept my broad shoulders hunched over the washing machine and asked her in a pathetic, trembling voice who would possibly hire a sick elderly man. A cruel, twisted smile slowly spread across her face. She told me that her brilliant son Bradley had graciously decided to take pity on his pathetic father. She explained that Bradley had recently expanded his new technology consulting startup, and he desperately needed a reliable night janitor to clean the executive offices. She took a deliberate step closer and lowered her voice into a vicious, degrading whisper. She told me I was going to scrub Bradley's toilets and empty his trash cans every single evening just to pay for the cheap, frozen food I consumed under her roof. She framed this ultimate humiliation as an act of profound family charity. My hands shook violently as I gripped the edge of the plastic laundry basket, but my mind was soaring with absolute predatory triumph. I knew from my midnight digital intercepts that Bradley's startup company generated zero actual revenue. It was nothing more than a sophisticated shell corporation specifically designed to launder the stolen mortgage funds before they were wired offshore. I desperately needed physical access to his office to clone his local hard drives and secure the secondary financial ledgers. Patricia truly thought she was punishing me. In reality, she was personally handing me the exact tactical advantage I needed to completely destroy her son. I gave her a slow, submissive nod and whispered my pathetic gratitude for the terrible job. Later that afternoon, I stood shivering violently at the corner bus stop. Bradley had driven past me an hour earlier in the gleaming new sports car purchased with my brother's stolen life savings. I rode the crowded city bus for 45 minutes across town to the upscale commercial business park. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the modern office building, keeping my chin tucked firmly against my chest. The massive lobby was a shrine to unearned arrogance. It featured polished concrete floors, expensive modern art, and sleek glass walls. I shuffled slowly toward the main reception desk of Bradley's company, wearing the oversized faded jacket that marked me as a man who had completely failed at life. A young receptionist chewing gum looked at me with immediate open suspicion until I quietly mentioned I was the new cleaning staff. She pointed a manicured finger toward the back hallway without even bothering to make eye contact with me. I found Bradley standing in the center of a large, open-plan workspace surrounded by half a dozen young employees. He was holding a cup of expensive artisan coffee and loudly boasting about a fake client acquisition. When he saw me slowly approaching, his entire demeanor shifted from arrogant tech executive to cruel feudal lord. He did not introduce me to his staff as his father. He completely erased our biological connection in front of his peers. He snapped his fingers loudly and ordered the room to quiet down immediately. He pointed directly at my chest and announced that I was the new janitor hired to clean up their daily messes. He walked over and stood mere inches from my face, staring down at me with cold, dead eyes. He told me that my schedule started after everyone else went home and he expected the executive bathrooms to be absolutely spotless. He cruelly warned me that if he found a single speck of dust on his expensive glass desk, he would fire me instantly and make sure I never found work in this city again. The sheer volume of his disrespect was physically sickening. This was the baby boy my twin brother had joyfully carried on his shoulders. This was the child William had worked grueling double shifts to send to an expensive private university. And now this spoiled, arrogant monster was humiliating his father for cheap office entertainment. Bradley reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a heavy steel ring holding a dozen brass keys. He did not hand them to me like a normal human being. He deliberately dropped them onto the polished floor right at my feet. The metal clattered loudly, echoing through the completely silent office. He ordered me to pick them up and get to work. I slowly dropped to my bruised knees and closed my fingers tightly around the cold steel ring. I kept my face hidden from his view, allowing a dark, lethal smile to finally cross my lips. As I stood back up, clutching the master keys to his entire fraudulent kingdom, I realized that Bradley had just made the final, fatal mistake of his miserable life. I now had total, unrestricted access to the nerve center of his criminal operation, and I was going to burn it completely to the ground. The sun finally dipped below the city skyline, casting long, dark shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corporate office. One by one, the young employees packed up their expensive laptops and headed for the elevators, laughing loudly about their evening plans. Bradley was the first to leave. He did not even look in my direction as he confidently strode out the glass doors, jingling his car keys. The heavy silence that settled over the empty workspace was my immediate signal to begin. I pushed the heavy plastic cleaning cart out of the supply closet. The squeaking wheels echoed loudly in the desolate lobby. I wore thick yellow rubber gloves and carried a plastic bucket filled with harsh industrial bleach. My first assigned task was the executive washroom. I walked into the pristine bathroom and stared at the porcelain fixtures. My twin brother was a man of profound dignity who had spent his entire life enriching the minds of young students. Now his own son expected him to kneel on cold bathroom tiles and scrub away the daily filth of arrogant tech executives. I lowered my body onto my knees, feeling the familiar sharp ache in my lower spine. I plunged the coarse brush into the chemical water and began to violently scrub the porcelain bowl. The pungent smell of bleach burned my nostrils and stung my eyes, but I embraced the intense physical discomfort. I deliberately performed the degrading manual labor with meticulous care. I knew that high-end corporate offices were heavily monitored by security cameras. I needed the recorded footage to show a broken, pathetic old man diligently performing his humiliating duties. I scrubbed the floors, wiped down the expensive mirrors, and emptied the heavy trash cans. I moved systematically through the space, completely masking my true intentions behind the rhythmic motion of a defeated janitor. But as soon as I finished the final bathroom, my entire physical demeanor drastically changed. I peeled off the thick rubber gloves and tossed them onto the cleaning cart. I rolled my broad shoulders back, stretching my aching muscles, and took a deep, steadying breath. I walked out onto the main open-plan workspace. The sprawling office was designed to project an image of massive technological innovation and robust financial success. Sleek white desks were arranged in collaborative clusters. Expensive ergonomic chairs sat empty, waiting for the next day of supposed brilliant work. But as I slowly walked past the workstations, my highly trained forensic eyes immediately noticed the glaring inconsistencies. A legitimate consulting firm handling high-level client accounts generates a massive physical footprint. There should have been whiteboards covered in complex project timelines. There should have been thick client dossiers stacked on the desks and busy printing stations filled with discarded project drafts. Instead, the entire office felt like an incredibly expensive movie set. The desks were completely barren. The few papers I found scattered around were simply generic printed articles about marketing trends and blank employee timesheets. There was absolutely no hard evidence of actual daily commerce occurring in this massive space. I pulled the heavy steel ring of master keys from my deep jacket pocket. Bradley had thrown these keys at my feet to assert his absolute dominance, but he had actually handed me the master pass to his entire criminal enterprise. I walked directly toward the large corner office featuring Bradley's name etched in frosted glass on the door. I slid the brass key into the lock and turned it with a satisfying click. I stepped into his private sanctuary and gently closed the heavy door behind me. The room was aggressively opulent. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, completely surrounded by expensive leather chairs and imported modern art. I did not waste time marveling at the stolen luxury. I immediately dropped to my knees and began rapidly picking the simple mechanical lock on the bottom drawer of his heavy wooden filing cabinet. The metal latch gave way in less than 10 seconds. I pulled the heavy drawer open and found exactly what I was looking for. It was not a collection of genuine client contracts. It was a perfectly organized series of thick financial ledgers documenting the absolute fraud of his tech startup. I pulled a small digital camera from my inner pocket and began photographing every single page with rapid mechanical precision. The digital shutter was completely silent as I captured the damning evidence. The financial structure was a textbook money laundering operation. It was a scheme so incredibly common and unoriginal that it frankly insulted my professional intelligence. Patricia was taking the massive chunks of cash she had illegally pulled from the forged secondary mortgage on the family home. She was then quietly transferring those stolen funds into the startup business accounts, completely disguised as anonymous venture capital investments and fake consulting fees. These were billed as advanced digital infrastructure development and global market analysis. They were vague, completely unquantifiable services that existed solely on paper. Bradley was essentially charging his own mother thousands of dollars every single week for imaginary digital services. Once the dirty money was officially processed through the corporate payroll and taxed at a minimal corporate rate, it became entirely legitimate clean income. The clean money was then aggressively funneled out of the business accounts through massive executive bonuses paid directly to Bradley and highly suspicious vendor payments sent straight to the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I photographed the wire transfer receipts that perfectly matched the numbered accounts I had discovered on Patricia's laptop the previous night. I found fake invoices billed to shell companies that did not even exist. I documented the fraudulent tax returns where Bradley brazenly claimed massive business losses while simultaneously purchasing luxury sports cars and expensive diamond jewelry for his greedy wife. He was not a brilliant technology entrepreneur. He was merely a glorified bagman for his mother, washing the blood money stolen from his own father. I sat back on my heels on the plush carpet, surrounded by the undeniable physical proof of their collective treason. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. Bradley had gladly participated in the complete financial destruction of the man who raised him simply to avoid getting a real job. He had traded his own father's secure retirement and vital health care for tailored Italian suits and a corner office with his name on the door. He felt absolutely zero remorse for forcing his supposed elderly father to scrub his toilets because in his sick mind he had already entirely discarded William as a useless human being. I carefully placed the financial ledgers back into the drawer in their exact original order. I knew I needed a complete digital clone of his main hard drive to guarantee the federal indictment, but the physical documents provided the exact roadmap I needed. I closed the heavy metal cabinet and locked it securely just as a sudden sound shattered the silence of the empty building. The distinct electronic chime of the front lobby elevator arriving at our floor echoed down the long hallway. Heavy, rapid footsteps began marching aggressively across the polished concrete floor, heading directly toward the executive suite. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized I was still standing deep inside the private office, far away from my cleaning cart. The trap I had meticulously built was perfect, but I was suddenly the one caught inside it. The heavy oak door to the executive office suddenly swung inward, hitting the wall with a violent crash. Bradley stormed into the room, his face flushed with an angry red heat. He had clearly forgotten something important, and the inconvenience had enraged him. I was standing less than 3 feet away from the locked mahogany filing cabinet, clutching a small plastic trash can I had grabbed in a split second of desperate improvisation. Bradley froze when he saw me standing deep inside his private sanctuary. The residual anger on his face instantly morphed into a dark, paranoid suspicion. He looked at the locked cabinet, then looked directly at my hands. He did not ask me what I was doing. He did not ask for a simple explanation. He lunged across the expensive Persian rug with the sudden, violent speed of an insecure bully. He grabbed the thick fabric of my oversized jacket, twisting the collar tightly around my neck, and violently shoved my entire body backward. My shoulders slammed aggressively against the heavy wooden wall panels. The sudden physical impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs. The plastic trash can clattered noisily to the floor, spilling empty coffee cups and crumpled papers across the plush carpet. Bradley pressed his forearm hard against my collarbone, pinning me firmly to the wall. He leaned his face incredibly close to mine, his breath smelling strongly of expensive scotch and cheap mints. He spoke in a low, vicious hiss, completely devoid of any human empathy. He demanded to know if I was snooping through his private business files. He accused me of trying to steal his corporate secrets because I was a pathetic, jealous failure who wanted to ruin his massive success. The sheer absolute delusion of his accusations was staggering. He was the one actively washing his mother's stolen money, yet he projected the crime of theft directly onto the very man they were both actively robbing. My internal reaction to his physical assault was instantaneous and violently primal. Every single muscle in my arms and legs coiled with explosive kinetic energy. I am not a frail, retired high school teacher. I have spent decades navigating dangerous situations with desperate corporate criminals. I knew exactly how to shift my weight, grab his extended forearm, snap his elbow joint backward, and drop him screaming to the floor in less than 2 seconds. The overwhelming desire to physically destroy this arrogant monster burned through my veins like liquid fire. My right fist clenched so tightly my fingernails bit deeply into my own palm. I stared directly into his dark, cruel eyes, and for one terrifying microscopic second, the carefully constructed facade of William Caldwell almost completely shattered. But the cold, ruthless logic of my forensic mind instantly overrode my aggressive physical instincts. If I fought back and easily overpowered a man half my age, I would instantly reveal my true identity. Patricia would be notified within minutes. The offshore Cayman accounts would be permanently drained and the family house would be lost to the bank forever. The absolute destruction of their criminal empire was vastly more important than satisfying my immediate bruised pride. I had to swallow the bitter metallic taste of sheer humiliation and completely neutralize his physical aggression using the only weapon William possessed. I had to use weaponized weakness. I instantly released the heavy tension in my shoulders and allowed my body to go completely limp against the wood paneling. I widened my eyes in a display of absolute raw terror. I forced my breathing to become incredibly rapid, shallow, and desperately erratic. I opened my mouth and let out a dry, gasping wheeze, deliberately mimicking the exact symptoms of a severe cardiovascular panic attack. I knew my brother suffered from a very real and very dangerous heart condition, and Bradley was acutely aware of his father's fragile medical history. I clutched my chest with both hands, grabbing handfuls of the worn jacket fabric, and began to slide slowly down the wall toward the floor. I allowed my knees to buckle entirely, collapsing into a pathetic, trembling heap directly at his expensive leather shoes. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a cold sweat to break out across my forehead, violently shaking my entire frame. I gasped loudly for air, sputtering and choking as if my lungs were entirely failing me. I looked up at him through half-closed eyes, silently begging for medical mercy. The sudden dramatic display of severe medical distress completely disrupted his violent momentum. Bradley instantly took a large step backward, pulling his hands away from my collar, as if he had just touched a burning stove. He was not stepping back out of genuine filial concern or sudden moral regret. He was stepping back out of a deep selfish fear of legal liability and personal inconvenience. He absolutely did not want a dead body lying in the middle of his fraudulent corporate office. He stared down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not pull out his phone to call for an emergency ambulance. He did not bend down to offer his father a comforting hand. He simply sneered at my violently trembling form. He kicked the spilled plastic trash can forcefully out of his way. He told me I was a completely pathetic, fragile embarrassment to the family name. He ordered me to get off his floor, clean up the mess I had just made, and never step foot near his private filing cabinets ever again. He warned me that if he ever caught me snooping, he would personally throw me into a state-run psychiatric ward and throw away the key. He turned his back on my gasping form, marched aggressively over to his mahogany desk, grabbed a forgotten leather portfolio, and stormed right back out of the office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind him, echoing loudly through the empty building. I remained on the floor for 3 full minutes, continuing the ragged breathing just in case he returned. When the absolute silence of the empty office finally settled around me, I stopped shaking. I slowly opened my eyes, dropping the pathetic facade entirely. My breathing returns to a slow, deep, and perfectly controlled rhythm. I pushed myself up from the carpet, dusting off the knees of my worn jacket. I had successfully survived the physical confrontation without blowing my cover, but the stakes of this operation had just escalated drastically. They were not just emotionally abusive thieves, they were physically dangerous. I picked up the plastic trash can and prepared to execute the final digital phase of the night. The absolute destruction of Bradley's life was no longer just a professional obligation. It had become a deeply personal necessity. I carried the plastic trash can back to its proper place beside the heavy mahogany desk. My breathing was completely normal now, but my mind was racing with incredible speed. Bradley had unwittingly given me the perfect cover. His arrogant assumption that I was merely a frail old man having a medical emergency entirely blinded him to the lethal reality of the situation. I stepped behind his large leather executive chair and looked down at the sleek desktop computer powering his fraudulent empire. I reached into the hidden lining of my oversized jacket and extracted a specialized solid-state cloning drive. This military-grade device was specifically engineered to bypass standard corporate firewalls and completely duplicate a massive hard drive in a matter of minutes. I located the hidden data port on the back of his machine and pushed the drive firmly into place. The small screen on my device illuminated with a bright blue light indicating a successful connection. I typed a rapid sequence of bypass commands onto his sleek keyboard and initiated the full system clone. The absolute destruction of his life was now actively downloading into the palm of my hand. The digital progress bar immediately appeared on my small screen, slowly creeping from 0 toward 100%. Every single second that ticked by felt like an agonizing eternity. Bradley was gone, but the modern office building was still patrolled by private security guards making their routine evening rounds. If a guard happened to look through the glass walls of the executive suite and saw the janitor typing aggressively on the primary computer, the entire operation would instantly collapse. I kept my eyes darting between the dark hallway outside the glass door and the slowly filling blue bar. While the massive volume of data transferred, I noticed a specific folder left carelessly open on his desktop monitor. It was labeled with a generic project name, but the contents were entirely devastating. I quickly scrolled through the visible documents and discovered the ultimate exit strategy. Bradley had already drafted the legal paperwork to completely dissolve the technology startup. The dates on the digital dissolution forms perfectly aligned with the bank foreclosure notice his mother had intercepted that very morning. They were not just planning to run away with the stolen money, they were actively orchestrating a synchronized financial implosion. Bradley had forged documents explicitly naming William as the primary financial guarantor for the fake consulting firm. He intended to leave my brother holding the bag for millions of dollars in fraudulent corporate debt on top of the ruined home mortgage. The sheer scale of their collective evil was breathtaking. The blue progress bar finally hit 100%. The small screen flashed a solid bright green, confirming the total extraction of his entire digital life. I had successfully captured every single encrypted email, every fake invoice, and every deleted bank transfer. I quickly pulled the cloning drive from the port and shoved it deeply back into my jacket pocket. I wiped the computer keyboard and the polished desk surface thoroughly with my harsh chemical sponge, ensuring I left absolutely no physical fingerprints behind. I spent the next 20 minutes meticulously finishing my assigned janitorial duties. I emptied every single trash can, I vacuumed the thick Persian rugs, and I polished the glass doors until they were perfectly transparent. I needed the building security cameras to record exactly what Bradley fully expected to see. They needed to capture the undeniable image of a completely broken man diligently performing his humiliating labor long after his arrogant boss had violently assaulted him. This digital alibi would prevent them from ever suspecting that the fatal blow had been struck from inside their own fortress. I pushed my heavy plastic cleaning cart out of the executive suite and back toward the main supply closet. The physical exhaustion of the long, grueling day was finally beginning to settle deeply into my older bones, but my spirit was burning with an unstoppable, triumphant fire. I stripped off the wet yellow rubber gloves, throwing them carelessly into the trash bin. I walked out of the silent office building into the freezing night air. I stood alone on the empty city sidewalk and reached into my deep pocket, feeling the cold, hard, metallic edge of the cloning drive. I now possessed the forged mortgage documents, the offshore routing numbers, the shell company ledgers, and the complete digital blueprint of their impending escape. The silent adjustment was no longer just a desperate conceptual plan. The trap was now fully armed and heavily loaded with irrefutable federal evidence. I pulled a secure burner phone from my inner pocket and dialed the private number of Nolan Gallagher, preparing to drop the massive legal guillotine directly onto their arrogant necks. The freezing night air whipped violently against my face as I walked rapidly away from the corporate business park. I reached deep into the pocket of my oversized jacket and gripped the cold plastic of my secure burner phone. I dialed a highly encrypted number I had perfectly memorized over 15 years ago. Nolan Gallagher answered on the second ring. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply asked for a secure location. I gave him the address of an abandoned industrial warehouse district located on the absolute outer edge of the city limits. Nolan was a former federal intelligence investigator who had successfully transitioned into the highly lucrative world of private corporate espionage. We had spent 2 decades working closely together, completely dismantling corrupt financial executives and destroying massive offshore tax evasion rings. He possessed a brilliant analytical mind like a steel trap and a rigid moral compass entirely aligned with my own ruthless brand of justice. I hailed a passing city taxi and forcefully instructed the driver to take me to the perimeter of the dark industrial zone. I paid the man in untraceable cash and walked the remaining half-mile through the desolate, cracked streets, making absolutely certain I was not being followed by private security. I approached a heavily rusted metal door situated at the back of a decaying textile warehouse and knocked 3 distinct, heavy times. The heavy steel door immediately swung open, revealing Nolan standing in the dim shadows. He was a tall, highly imposing man with sharp, calculating gray eyes and a stoic demeanor completely devoid of unnecessary human emotion. He took one long, analytical look at my hunched physical posture, the faded, oversized jacket, and the cheap gray hair dye coating my scalp. He did not ask any ridiculous or insulting questions about my pathetic appearance. He simply stepped aside and aggressively locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The interior of the massive warehouse was a startling contrast to the decaying brick exterior. It was a highly secure, temporary tactical operations center. Banks of powerful high-definition computer monitors glowed brightly against the cold concrete walls, completely surrounded by heavy encrypted data servers and secure satellite communication arrays. I walked slowly over to a long metal folding table and dropped the agonizing physical weight of my false persona completely. I stood up to my full imposing height, rolling my broad, tight shoulders and taking a deep, steadying breath of the stale, dry air. I reached into my worn jacket and pulled out the solid-state cloning drive, the tiny metallic keystroke logger, and the digital camera containing the high-resolution photographs of Bradley's physical ledgers. I laid the electronic devices carefully onto the cold metal table. I looked directly at Nolan and told him I had completely captured the beast inside its own cage. Nolan pulled up a heavy steel chair and immediately went to work without uttering a single word. He carefully connected the cloned hard drive to an isolated computer terminal that was completely disconnected from the vulnerable public internet. He then precisely plugged in the microscopic keystroke logger I had successfully retrieved from Patricia's luxury bedroom. For the next 3 intense hours, we stood shoulder to shoulder in the harsh artificial light of the computer monitors, meticulously synchronizing the raw digital data. This was the exact, precise environment where I felt the absolute most powerful. We were no longer navigating the messy, unpredictable world of emotional domestic abuse. We were actively operating in the cold, hard, unforgiving realm of absolute forensic truth. Nolan ran a highly customized decrypting software program that rapidly unspooled Bradley's secure internal email servers. At the exact same time, I systematically cross-referenced the captured keystroke data, highlighting every single encrypted password and hidden routing number Patricia had blindly typed into her expensive laptop. The perfectly synchronized data rapidly painted a picture of absolute financial depravity that far exceeded even my darkest professional expectations. We watched the glowing screens intently as the distinct scattered pieces of the massive criminal puzzle perfectly interlocked. We easily verified the forged signatures on the secondary mortgage documents and accurately traced the exact chronological moment the National Bank wired the massive sum of cash directly into Patricia's personal checking account. We then flawlessly tracked that exact same stolen money as she aggressively funneled it directly into Bradley's technology startup shell company. Nolan opened the cloned financial ledgers I had photographed inside the locked mahogany cabinet. We laid the digital documents side by side with the physical photographic evidence. The fake consulting invoices perfectly matched the exact massive dollar amounts Patricia was continuously transferring. Bradley was brazenly billing his own mother for entirely fabricated digital services, systematically washing the stolen mortgage money through his corporate payroll to make it appear completely legitimate. But the absolute most devastating discovery occurred when we meticulously followed the newly cleaned money rapidly exiting the startup company accounts. We traced the massive fraudulent executive bonuses and the fake international vendor payments directly to the numbered offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. Nolan used his specialized dark web intelligence network to forcefully penetrate the first digital layer of the offshore banking firewall. He absolutely confirmed the secret account was jointly held by Patricia and the local luxury real estate broker named Vincent. The entire elaborate money laundering loop was now flawlessly documented and preserved. We possessed the exact calendar dates, the precise timestamps, and the undeniable digital fingerprints of every single fraudulent financial transaction. They had violently weaponized my twin brother's profound, trusting nature to steal his family home, wash the bloody money through a fake technology company, and hide the massive profits in an untraceable tropical vault. Nolan, who had witnessed the absolute worst behavior of corporate humanity during his long federal career, shook his head in profound, utter disgust. He stated that he had never seen a mother and son operate with such a sickening lack of basic human empathy toward their own flesh and blood. Nolan leaned back heavily in his steel chair and crossed his strong arms over his chest. He looked at the massive, undeniable digital dossier we had just successfully compiled. He stated with absolute clinical certainty that we currently possessed more than enough hard physical evidence to secure multiple devastating federal convictions. This was absolutely not a simple civil dispute over a stolen teacher's pension or a messy suburban divorce. This was a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit massive wire fraud, aggressive bank fraud, and severe federal money laundering. The mandatory federal sentencing guidelines for these highly specific financial crimes carried a minimum requirement of 20 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Bradley would instantly lose his luxurious fake lifestyle, his expensive imported sports car, and his arrogant, unearned freedom. Patricia would completely lose her stolen millions, her secret romantic escape, and her entire comfortable, entitled world. They would be violently stripped of absolutely everything they valued and locked inside cold concrete cages for the rest of their natural lives. I stared coldly at the glowing computer monitors, feeling a profound, deep sense of lethal satisfaction settle into my bones. The pathetic, broken old man they had aggressively forced to scrub their dirty kitchen floor and violently clean their corporate office toilets was currently holding the absolute power of their total permanent destruction in the palm of his hand. But I knew with absolute tactical certainty that we could not simply hand this massive mountain of evidence over to the local city police department. Local municipal authorities moved far too slowly, and Patricia was already actively preparing to flee the country with Vincent. The bank foreclosure notice had triggered an aggressive, highly dangerous countdown. We desperately needed to strike a massive, invisible, paralyzing blow immediately. We had to completely sever their access to the stolen offshore funds and securely trap them inside the burning wreckage of their own fraudulent financial empire before they even realized the match had been lit. I turned to Nolan and firmly instructed him to prepare the massive federal submission package for the district attorney. But more importantly, I ordered him to immediately activate his highest-level contacts operating within the Internal Revenue Service. The lethal trap was fully constructed and perfectly baited. It was finally time to quietly lock the heavy steel doors and watch the arrogant monsters slowly begin to panic. I left Nolan Gallagher in the secure warehouse and stepped back out into the freezing pre-dawn darkness. The massive federal submission package was currently being compiled, but I absolutely could not wait for the slow bureaucratic wheels of the Justice Department to turn. Patricia and her real estate lover Vincent were actively preparing to board a plane and vanish into the Caribbean. I needed an immediate, catastrophic tactical strike that would completely paralyze her financial mobility without revealing my presence. I walked 2 blocks down the desolate industrial street and found an all-night diner bathed in harsh fluorescent light. I sat in a booth at the very back of the empty restaurant, ordered a black coffee, and pulled out my secure burner phone. I dialed a highly restricted direct line to the United States Department of the Treasury. I was calling Special Agent Christopher Cole. 20 years ago, Christopher was a young, ambitious investigator completely drowning in a massive multi-state corporate embezzlement case. He was entirely out of his depth and about to lose his job. I was the independent forensic auditor who stepped in, completely reconstructed his shattered financial timeline, and handed him the exact evidence he needed to secure the convictions and save his career. Christopher Cole owed me a massive professional debt, and I was finally calling to collect it. He answered the phone with a sharp, tired voice. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I identified myself and told him I had a massive, active money laundering operation completely tied to fraudulent domestic mortgages and offshore tax evasion. I told him the primary targets were actively preparing to flee the country with the stolen millions. Christopher immediately recognized the cold urgency in my voice. I used the diner network to route through the encrypted server Nolan had just built and securely transmit the specific routing numbers of the Cayman Island accounts and the fraudulent technology shell company. I did not send the full dossier containing the domestic abuse or the forged signatures. I only sent the pure, raw financial data. Christopher looked at the digital numbers on his secure terminal and let out a low whistle of absolute disbelief. The sheer brazen stupidity of Bradley, transferring heavily taxed domestic funds directly into flagged offshore banking havens, was a massive red flag for any federal investigator. Christopher confirmed that the financial structure perfectly matched the exact profile of a major criminal syndicate washing illicit cash. I forcefully instructed him to execute an immediate emergency asset freeze using the absolute full power of federal anti-money laundering statutes. I demanded that he flag every single domestic bank account, credit card, and international wire transfer associated with both Patricia and Bradley. The federal asset freeze is an incredibly beautiful and terrifying weapon. It does not require a lengthy courtroom trial or a formal judicial hearing to initiate. Once an authorized federal agent flags a financial network for severe money laundering, the global banking system reacts with absolute ruthless efficiency. Automated algorithms instantly lock the targeted accounts to prevent the illicit movement of funds. The offshore banks located in the Cayman Islands rely heavily on their access to the American financial system. They will immediately freeze a client account the exact second the American Treasury Department issues a red flag, simply to avoid facing massive federal sanctions themselves. Christopher typed the commands into his terminal while I listened to the rapid clicking of his keyboard over the phone line. He confirmed that the emergency freeze protocol was officially initiated. Within the next 4 hours, as the global banking servers slowly synchronized their daily data, every single dollar Patricia had stolen from my twin brother would become entirely inaccessible. She would not be able to withdraw cash transfer funds or even purchase a simple plane ticket. Her entire, carefully constructed, wealthy escape route was now completely blocked by an invisible, impenetrable wall of federal authority. I thanked Christopher for his prompt service, completely destroyed the burner phone by crushing it under my heavy leather boot, and left the diner. I caught a city bus back to the wealthy suburban neighborhood, arriving just as the sun began to slowly rise over the manicured lawns. I stopped at the edge of the property and violently forced myself back into the pathetic physical shell of William Caldwell. I hunched my broad shoulders forward, tucked my chin deeply into my chest, and adopted the slight, terrified tremor in my hands. I unlocked the heavy front door and shuffled quietly into the grand foyer. The sprawling house was completely silent. I walked directly into the kitchen and began preparing the complicated morning coffee exactly the way Patricia demanded it every single day. 10 minutes later, Patricia walked into the kitchen wearing her expensive silk morning robe. She looked incredibly refreshed and entirely self-satisfied. She did not even acknowledge my physical presence as I placed the hot ceramic mug on the black granite counter. She simply picked up her glowing digital tablet and began scrolling through luxury travel websites, completely unaware that she was now looking at vacations she could never afford. She loudly complained about the terrible weather and casually mentioned that she would be spending the entire afternoon shopping at the high-end luxury boutiques downtown. She wanted to purchase a completely new designer wardrobe for her upcoming tropical trip with her lover. I kept my head bowed and my eyes fixed firmly on the floorboards, but a cold, lethal smile spread across my face, hidden entirely in the shadows. I gave her a pathetic, submissive nod and whispered that I hoped she had a wonderful day. She sneered at my broken voice, grabbed her expensive leather handbag, and marched out of the room. The invisible guillotine had been successfully dropped. The heavy steel blade was currently falling silently through the air. All I had to do now was patiently wait in the dark for her to blindly stick her arrogant neck directly onto the chopping block. I spent the entire afternoon meticulously maintaining the absolute illusion of my brother's pathetic existence. I vacuumed the heavy Persian rugs in the living room and polished the antique silverware in the formal dining room. The sprawling suburban house was suffocatingly quiet. I knew the global financial network was actively executing my silent commands, locking the stolen millions behind impenetrable digital walls, but the physical world remained completely still. I was standing at the kitchen sink, slowly washing a ceramic coffee mug when I finally heard the aggressive screech of heavy tires in the driveway. The thick front door did not simply open. It was violently thrown backwards, slamming against the interior wall with a deafening crash that shook the floorboards. Patricia stormed into the grand foyer. She was not carrying a single shopping bag. Her expensive designer sunglasses were pushed aggressively into her perfectly styled hair. Her face was contorted into a hideous mask of absolute feral rage. The carefully curated facade of the wealthy suburban socialite had entirely evaporated, completely replaced by the panicked fury of a trapped animal. I kept my broad shoulders heavily hunched and slowly turned away from the sink, clutching a damp dish towel to my chest. I asked her in a pathetic, trembling voice if she had enjoyed her shopping trip. My completely innocent question acted as a lit match, dropped directly into a massive pool of gasoline. She screamed at me with a terrifying volume that physically rattled the crystal chandelier hanging directly above her head. She shrieked that her platinum credit card had been publicly declined at the most exclusive luxury boutique in the entire city. She had been standing confidently at the checkout counter holding $5,000 worth of imported silk resort wear, while the young cashier loudly informed her that the transaction was permanently flagged for severe fraud. She had aggressively tried 3 different backup credit cards. Every single piece of plastic she pulled from her designer wallet was instantly rejected by the banking system. The store manager had humiliatingly asked her to step aside, while her wealthy socialite friends stood directly behind her in line, whispering viciously behind their manicured hands. Her public humiliation was absolute and entirely devastating. She marched aggressively into the kitchen, her designer heels striking the polished marble floor like angry hammer blows. She completely ignored the wet dish towel in my trembling hands and began tearing through the items on the black granite countertops. She pulled out her glowing digital tablet and furiously tapped the screen, desperately trying to access her private banking applications. I watched the blood completely drain from her flushed face as the bright red error messages flashed repeatedly across the glass surface. Her secret offshore routing numbers were entirely invalid. The massive Cayman Island accounts holding my brother's stolen life savings were digitally locked and completely inaccessible. She pulled out her phone and frantically dialed her real estate lover Vincent, but the call went straight to a generic automated voicemail. The federal asset freeze had cast a massive suffocating net over their entire criminal conspiracy, and she was just now realizing she was trapped tightly inside it. She hurled the expensive digital tablet directly against the custom oak cabinetry. The glass screen shattered violently into 100 jagged pieces, raining down onto the floor. She turned her blinding, furious rage entirely onto me. She violently blamed my pathetic financial history for her current banking errors. She screamed that my ruined credit must have somehow infected her pristine accounts. Her breathing became dangerously erratic as the pure panic finally overwhelmed her arrogant logic. She reached blindly across the massive kitchen island and wrapped her manicured fingers tightly around a heavy crystal water goblet. She did not hesitate for a single microscopic second. She hurled the thick, heavy glass directly at my face with genuine lethal intent. The heavy crystal projectile sliced rapidly through the air, aimed perfectly at the bridge of my nose. My extensive forensic field training and years of intense physical combat conditioning instantly took completely over. I did not cower blindly like a broken old man. I shifted my entire body weight smoothly onto my back foot and snapped my head sharply to the left with absolute lightning speed. The heavy crystal goblet flew harmlessly past my right ear and shattered violently against the stainless steel refrigerator directly behind me, leaving a deep, permanent dent in the expensive metal. I realized my massive, fatal mistake the exact second the heavy glass shattered. William Caldwell absolutely did not possess the athletic physical reflexes of a highly trained combat veteran. He was a frail, sick man who would have taken that brutal impact directly to the face. Patricia froze entirely, her chest heaving as her angry eyes widened in sudden dark suspicion. She registered my impossible physical speed and the deadly calm expression that had briefly crossed my face. I had to instantly bury my lethal competence before she could fully process what she had just witnessed. I deliberately twisted my right ankle and threw my entire body violently backward onto the hard marble floor. I let out a loud, pathetic cry of pure terror, scrambling frantically backward like a beaten dog until my shoulders hit the bottom wooden cabinets. I curled my large frame into a tight, defensive ball, wrapping my arms securely over my head and begging her loudly not to hurt me again. I cried out that I had simply tripped over my own clumsy feet trying to run away. She stared down at my trembling, pathetic form for 10 long seconds, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Her arrogant brain finally accepted the pathetic lie because the absolute truth was entirely incomprehensible to her. She sneered at my cowardice and marched rapidly out of the kitchen, pulling out her phone to call Bradley. The physical illusion was entirely safe, but the final violent countdown had officially begun. I remained curled on the cold kitchen floor long after the sound of her frantic footsteps faded down the hallway. I listened carefully as Patricia aggressively dialed her son. Her voice was no longer commanding or arrogant. It was shrill and completely saturated with genuine terror. She paced the length of the formal living room, screaming into the receiver that their entire financial network had completely collapsed. She demanded that Bradley instantly wire her $50,000 from his corporate startup accounts to bypass her frozen credit cards. But the panicked silence stretching across the phone line was her second devastating blow of the afternoon. Bradley stammered weakly, admitting that his corporate accounts were also entirely locked by the banking institution. The federal authorities had perfectly synchronized the financial freeze across their entire criminal enterprise. Patricia let out a guttural scream of absolute frustration and hurled her phone violently onto the plush sofa. The brilliant tropical escape plan she had meticulously designed with her real estate lover was rapidly disintegrating right in front of her eyes. The luxury offshore accounts were useless. Her domestic credit was destroyed. She was suddenly completely trapped in the massive suburban house she had fraudulently mortgaged. She was completely cut off from the massive fortune she had stolen from my twin brother. But cornered predators do not simply surrender. They lash out with extreme, unpredictable violence. Patricia absolutely refused to accept defeat and wait for the slow legal process of the impending bank foreclosure. She desperately needed liquid, untraceable cash immediately to flee the country before the authorities knocked on her front door. I slowly pushed myself up from the marble floor and crept silently down the hallway, stopping just outside the living room archway. I watched from the deep shadows as she pulled a secondary burner phone from her designer handbag. She did not call a reputable real estate agent. She frantically dialed a number she had ripped from a cheap predatory billboard on the highway. She was calling a notorious cash buyer known for exploiting desperate homeowners facing imminent bankruptcy. These shadowy investors bought properties for a fraction of their actual market value, offering immediate physical cash and completely bypassing standard legal inspections. They did not care about hidden mortgage fraud. They only cared about securing a massive profit margin. Patricia practically begged the man to purchase the estate immediately. She offered to sell him the beautiful custom-built home for less than half of its appraised value simply to secure the cash before the federal freeze expanded further. She boldly promised the skeptical buyer a massive financial discount if he could finalize the entire transaction within 24 hours. The predatory investor eagerly sensed her overwhelming desperation and agreed to the aggressive timeline. Patricia loudly confirmed the final details. The buyer would arrive at the house the very next evening at exactly 7 o'clock. He would bring a certified cashier check and the binding legal documents required to transfer the complete property title. Patricia confidently assured him that her husband would be completely cooperative and willing to sign away his entire legal ownership. She hung up the burner phone and let out a manic, breathless laugh. I knew exactly what she was planning. She had absolutely no intention of letting me read those legal documents. She was going to forge my brother's signature on a comprehensive power of attorney form just like she had done with the secondary mortgage. She intended to sell the house right out from under me, hand the cash directly to her lover, and completely vanish into the night, leaving me physically locked inside a home I no longer owned. The timeline of my forensic operation had just violently collapsed. I no longer had 30 days to slowly build the federal case and cleanly execute the silent adjustment. The absolute final confrontation was now forcefully scheduled for the very next evening. Patricia thought she was cleverly engineering her ultimate escape, but she was actually building the perfect stage for her own public execution. She was inviting a predatory buyer directly into the house while her guilty son and his greedy wife were also scheduled to attend another lavish family dinner. Every single guilty party would be gathered together in the exact same room at the exact same time. It was a flawless tactical opportunity. I walked silently back down into the freezing basement and opened my encrypted laptop. I sent a single secure message to Nolan Gallagher, instructing him to completely finalize the federal dossiers and prepare the local law enforcement authorities for an immediate physical deployment. The lethal trap was fully loaded, and the arrogant prey was eagerly marching right toward the absolute center. I closed the heavy computer monitor and smiled coldly in the dark, completely ready to end her 30-year reign of terrifying abuse. Exactly at 7 o'clock, the heavy brass doorbell chimed, echoing through the grand foyer. I stood silently in the dark shadows of the dining room archway, watching the final act of this grotesque tragedy unfold. Patricia rushed to the front door, her designer heels clicking frantically against the marble floor. She pulled the door open to reveal a short, heavily perfumed man wearing a cheap, shiny suit and clutching a thick leather briefcase. This was the predatory cash buyer she had desperately summoned. He stepped into the pristine house with the hungry, calculating eyes of a scavenger evaluating a fresh carcass. He did not care about the beautiful custom architecture or the meticulously landscaped gardens. He only saw a desperate woman willing to surrender a highly valuable asset for a fraction of its true worth. Patricia greeted him with a wide, entirely fabricated smile, masking the absolute panic of her frozen bank accounts behind a thick layer of forced hospitality. She guided him smoothly into the formal living room where Bradley and Monica were already comfortably seated on the expensive plush sofas. Bradley stood up and aggressively shook the buyer hand, projecting his usual arrogant tech executive persona. He poured the man a generous glass of imported scotch from his father's private crystal decanter, acting as if he was the supreme master of the estate. Monica sat with her legs elegantly crossed, slowly sipping her wine and offering the slick investor a polite, greedy smile. They were the absolute picture of a united, loving family making a difficult but necessary financial decision. They casually gathered around the massive glass coffee table, the exact center of their impending destruction. The buyer placed his worn leather briefcase on the glass surface and snapped the brass locks open. The sharp metallic click sounded like a firing squad loading their rifles. He pulled out a thick stack of crisp legal documents and carefully spread them across the table. These were not simple real estate transfer forms. They were the physical instruments of my twin brother, absolute execution. The buyer cleared his throat and began to formally explain the complex paperwork. He laid out the absolute transfer of the property title, the immediate waiver of all standard legal inspections, and the highly irregular fraudulent power of attorney form. Patricia had boldly claimed that William was completely mentally incapacitated and entirely unable to manage his own legal affairs. She had successfully forged his signature on this massive document, granting herself total unrestricted authority to liquidate his final remaining asset. The buyer ran his thick fingers over the forged signature. He was a professional bottom feeder who absolutely recognized a highly suspicious transaction when he saw one. But the massive discount Patricia had frantically offered him was simply too lucrative to pass up. He chose to look completely the other way, happily ignoring the glaring legal red flags in exchange for a massive instant profit. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a certified bank cashier check. He placed it deliberately in the exact center of the glass table. It was a staggering sum of liquid, untraceable cash. It was the exact financial fuel Patricia desperately needed to bypass the Federal Asset Freeze Board, an international flight, and completely vanish into the Caribbean with her secret lover. I watched from the dark hallway as the three monsters stared hungrily at the small piece of paper. Bradley licked his lips greedily, already calculating his massive unearned percentage. Monica leaned forward, her eyes shining with pure materialistic lust, entirely ready to spend blood money on more useless diamond jewelry. Patricia let out a long, shaky breath of absolute, profound relief. She truly believed she had successfully outsmarted the global banking system and completely secured her wealthy escape. She reached out with a perfectly manicured hand and picked up a heavy gold fountain pen resting beside the documents. She did not show a single microscopic ounce of human hesitation. She did not express a single moment of quiet remorse for the gentle, loyal husband she was currently rendering permanently homeless. She positioned the sharp gold nib of the pen directly over the thick signature line on the final transfer deed. She was entirely ready to sign her own name, legally validating the massive fraud and entirely erasing William Caldwell from the very home he had spent 30 years paying for. The suffocating tension in the room was incredibly thick, heavy with the toxic weight of their collective betrayal. They were all completely focused on the flowing dark ink, eagerly anticipating the massive influx of cash. They felt absolutely invincible, sitting in their warm, brightly lit living room, completely unaware that the dark shadows in the hallway were finally about to violently step forward. The flawless legal trap was now perfectly set right in front of them, waiting for the absolute final strike. The heavy gold fountain pen hovered mere millimeters above the thick signature line. I stepped out of the dark hallway and into the bright light of the formal living room. I did not shuffle my feet. I did not drag my heavy leather boots across the expensive Persian rug. I took long, deliberate strides that echoed with absolute authority. As I crossed the threshold, I completely abandoned the pathetic physical shell I had inhabited for the past torturous week. I rolled my broad shoulders backward, feeling my spine straighten and lock into its natural, rigid alignment. The agonizing ache in my lower back instantly vanished, completely replaced by a massive surge of pure kinetic energy. I raised my chin and stared directly at the 4 people gathered around the glass coffee table. I grew 3 inches taller in a matter of seconds, completely shedding the manufactured frailty of the abused husband. The predatory cash buyer was the very first person to notice my sudden towering presence. He looked up from the fraudulent documents and his oily smile instantly evaporated. He instinctively pulled his hands away from the certified bank check, sensing an immediate and overwhelming physical threat entering the space. Patricia kept her eyes focused entirely on the paper, completely oblivious to the massive shift in the room dynamics. She pressed the gold nib of the pen against the paper, ready to legally execute my brother. I crossed the room in 3 rapid strides. I did not ask her to stop. I did not politely interrupt their illegal transaction. I reached out with my large hand and violently snatched the thick transfer deed directly off the glass table. The sudden, aggressive motion startled Patricia so severely that she dropped the expensive fountain pen. The gold metal clattered loudly against the glass surface, spilling a dark pool of black ink across the remaining legal forms. Patricia leaped out of her plush chair, her face contorted in a mask of absolute feral outrage. She screamed at me, demanding to know what I was doing and ordering me to get back down into the dark basement where I belonged. She raised her hand, preparing to physically strike me just as she had attempted with the heavy crystal goblet earlier that afternoon. She fully expected me to cower and beg for mercy, but I did not cower, and I did not flinch. I reached out and caught her raised wrist midair. My grip was entirely composed of cold, unbreakable iron. I squeezed her fragile wrist just hard enough to send a clear, undeniable message of absolute physical dominance. Her furious scream died instantly in her throat, completely replaced by a sharp gasp of sudden, genuine terror. She stared into my pale blue eyes and realized she was absolutely not looking at the broken man she had tortured for 30 years. The eyes staring back at her were completely devoid of fear, entirely filled with a cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless promise of absolute destruction. I released her wrist and let her arm drop uselessly to her side. I spoke for the very first time in my true, natural voice. The pathetic, trembling whisper was completely gone. My voice resonated deep from my chest, filling the massive living room with a cold, lethal authority. I told her that my name was Richard Caldwell. I watched the absolute horrifying realization wash over her face as she processed the impossible truth. She took a stumbling step backward, her eyes darting frantically over my facial features, finally recognizing the subtle differences she had been far too arrogant to notice before. She noticed the lack of deep, permanent fear lines around my mouth and the thick, dense muscle mass hidden beneath the oversized jacket. I reached inside the deep inner pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out the massive forensic dossier Nolan Gallagher had meticulously compiled at the secure warehouse. The thick manila folder contained hundreds of pages of undeniable federal evidence. I raised the heavy dossier high above my head and slammed it violently down onto the glass coffee table directly on top of the spilled black ink. The deafening crack of the impact made Bradley and Monica jump visibly in their seats, clutching each other in sudden panic. I looked directly at the predatory cash buyer and told him in a low, dangerous tone that the property deed he was attempting to purchase was entirely fraudulent. I informed him that the signature on the primary mortgage was a documented forgery and that the federal authorities were currently monitoring the house. The cheap investor turned completely pale, grabbed his empty leather briefcase, and scrambled frantically toward the front door, abandoning the certified check entirely. He threw the heavy front door open and sprinted into the freezing night, completely desperate to escape the massive legal explosion that was currently detonating inside the house. I turned my attention back to Patricia, who was currently trembling violently against the armrest of the sofa. I did not give her a single second to formulate a new lie or attempt a desperate denial. I systematically dismantled her entire criminal existence using the cold, hard facts I had extracted from her own laptop. I told her about the microscopic keystroke logger I had successfully planted on her silver computer while she slept soundly in the master bedroom, completely unaware that her worst nightmare was standing directly beside her bed. I recited the exact 6-digit combination to the heavy floor safe hidden beneath her kitchen island. I watched her perfectly styled hair tremble as I casually mentioned her real estate lover Vincent, and the highly detailed tropical escape plan they had foolishly coordinated through unencrypted draft emails. The color entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly incredibly old. But the absolute final killing blow was the money. I leaned forward, resting my large hands flat on the glass table, and informed her that she was completely broke. I explained that I was the specific architect of the massive federal asset freeze that had publicly humiliated her at the luxury boutique that afternoon. I told her that the numbered Cayman Island accounts were completely locked by the United States Treasury Department and that every single dollar she had stolen from my twin brother was currently being seized by the federal government. The fake wealthy world she had built upon William's profound suffering was entirely reduced to ash. She had traded her basic human decency for a massive fortune that currently belonged to the federal authorities. Bradley finally recovered from his initial state of complete shock. He jumped up from his leather chair, his face flushed with the exact same arrogant rage he had displayed in his corporate office. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest and aggressively accused me of making up insane lies. He loudly declared that his technology startup was a massively successful legitimate enterprise and that I was just a jealous old man trying to ruin his brilliant career. I slowly turned my head and looked at my spoiled nephew with a level of absolute disgust I usually reserved for violent corporate predators. I casually listed the exact names of the fake consulting clients he had fabricated to launder the stolen mortgage funds. I told him about the military-grade cloning drive I had successfully plugged into his desktop computer while he mistakenly thought I was suffering a fatal heart attack on his office floor. I watched the arrogant color completely drain from his face as I recited the exact massive dollar amounts he had fraudulently transferred to the offshore accounts just 24 hours ago. I informed him that the thick dossier sitting on the glass table contained a completely airtight federal indictment for severe wire fraud and massive corporate money laundering. I told Bradley that he was not a brilliant technology entrepreneur but simply a pathetic common thief who was about to spend the next 20 years of his natural life inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Monica let out a high-pitched shriek of absolute terror, finally realizing that her endless supply of diamond bracelets and luxury vacations had just instantly transformed into a massive federal prison sentence. The trap was completely sprung, and the arrogant monsters were entirely paralyzed by the blinding light of the absolute truth. The cold winter wind blew violently through the wide-open front door, left behind by the fleeing cash buyer. The freezing air swirled aggressively around the formal living room, completely shattering the stifling, toxic warmth they had enjoyed for 30 years. Bradley stared down at the massive federal dossier resting heavily on the glass coffee table. The arrogant color had entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, confused child. His mind frantically tried to process the absolute sudden destruction of his fraudulent technology empire. He realized with sickening absolute clarity that the thick manila folder contained his permanent ruin. In his desperate, panicked state, he made a massive, fatal tactical error. He actually believed that destroying the physical paper documents would somehow erase the massive digital evidence currently sitting safely on federal treasury servers. His fear instantly mutated into a blind, violent rage. He let out a primal, furious scream and lunged aggressively across the glass coffee table, directly toward me. He did not attack me with any trained martial skill or calculated discipline. He charged at me with the reckless, flailing violence of a spoiled, entitled bully who had never lost a physical fight in his entire privileged life. He reached out with both hands, his fingers curled into tight claws, desperately trying to grab my throat and tackle my larger frame to the floor. But I was absolutely not the fragile, sick twin brother he was entirely accustomed to abusing. I did not retreat a single inch. I planted my heavy leather boots firmly onto the expensive Persian rug, establishing a completely immovable physical base. As his hands shot forward, I swiftly sidestepped his clumsy attack, entirely utilizing his own aggressive forward momentum directly against him. I reached out and grabbed his right wrist with my left hand, clamping down with bone-crushing force. I simultaneously drove my right forearm violently into the back of his tricep, forcibly bending his arm into a highly unnatural, agonizing angle. I pivoted my hips sharply and executed a flawless mechanical joint lock. I used my entire upper body weight to drive him violently downward. I forced his face directly into the polished marble floor. The heavy impact of his skull hitting the cold stone echoed loudly through the grand foyer. I immediately dropped my weight and pressed my heavy knee firmly against the center of his spine, pinning him completely to the ground while maintaining the agonizing upward pressure on his twisted shoulder joint. Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail of pure physical agony. He thrashed his legs wildly against the floorboards, desperately trying to escape, but he was completely helpless against the calculated mechanical restraint. I leaned my face down close to his ear and told him in a cold, dead voice to stop moving immediately, or I would permanently shatter his collarbone. He instantly froze, his chest heaving with terrified, ragged breaths, entirely subdued by a man twice his age. He finally realized he possessed absolutely no real power in the actual physical world. Patricia witnessed the absolute physical defeat of her golden child, and her entire psychological reality permanently snapped. The wealthy suburban socialite completely vanished. She dropped heavily onto her knees right beside the glass coffee table, her expensive silk dressing gown pooling carelessly around her on the floor. She stared at the dark black ink completely staining the fraudulent property deed and began to sob uncontrollably. Her entire body shook with massive violent tremors. She crawled across the expensive rug toward my heavy boots, raising her perfectly manicured hands in a pathetic gesture of absolute total surrender. She loudly begged me for legal forgiveness, weeping that she had made a terrible, catastrophic mistake and promising to return every single stolen dollar. She pleaded with me to tear up the federal dossier and simply let them quietly leave the country tonight. I looked down at her tear-stained face, feeling absolutely zero human pity. I kept my knee firmly pressed into her sun back and asked her a simple question. I asked her if she remembered the cold, freezing rain from last Tuesday night. I asked her if she remembered sitting safely in this warm house and laughing loudly into the phone while my gentle twin brother begged her for the $70 he desperately needed to keep his fragile heart beating. Her sobbing abruptly stopped, and her eyes widened in absolute horror as the sheer magnitude of her own cruelty was forcefully reflected right back at her. I told her that legal mercy was a beautiful, rare gift reserved exclusively for decent human beings, and she had entirely forfeited her basic humanity a very long time ago. The heavy, suffocating silence of the living room was suddenly broken by a sharp, piercing sound echoing from the distant highway. It was the high-pitched wail of multiple police sirens rapidly approaching the quiet suburban neighborhood. I had explicitly instructed Nolan Gallagher to dispatch the local law enforcement tactical units exactly 10 minutes before I stepped out of the dark hallway. The screaming sirens grew significantly louder and vastly more intense with every passing second, completely drowning out the pathetic, terrified weeping of the broken woman on the floor. Bright, flashing red and blue lights suddenly pierced the large front bay windows, casting violent, chaotic shadows across the expensive custom furniture. Monica scrambled backward into the furthest, darkest corner of the room, clutching her diamond necklace and screaming hysterically as the heavy boots of armed police officers began storming rapidly up the front driveway. The invisible trap I had meticulously built over the past 7 days was now permanently locked. The arrogant monsters were completely surrounded, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth, and forcefully pinned to the floor, waiting for the heavy iron doors of the federal penitentiary to slam shut behind them forever. 5 heavily armed federal agents stormed through the wide-open front door of the sprawling suburban house. Their thick tactical boots pounded aggressively against the polished marble floor, completely shattering the last remaining illusion of suburban safety. The lead officer took one long look at the massive federal dossier resting on the glass coffee table and immediately barked harsh tactical orders. 2 large officers advanced rapidly toward the living room sofa where Patricia was still kneeling helplessly on the expensive Persian rug. She raised her perfectly manicured hands in a final desperate plea for mercy, but the federal agents did not offer a single microscopic ounce of sympathy. They grabbed her fragile wrists, roughly twisted her arms forcefully behind her back, and locked heavy, cold steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed loudly through the grand foyer, sounding exactly like the closing of a heavy prison vault door. Another pair of highly trained officers hauled Bradley violently up from the cold floorboards. His tailored Italian suit was entirely ruined, smeared with dark black ink and floor dust. He frantically tried to stammer a pathetic, weak excuse about a massive misunderstanding, but the arresting officer forcefully shoved him face first against the custom oak-paneled wall. The officer coldly recited his permanent Miranda rights. Every single word of the standard legal warning acted as a brutal hammer blow, entirely destroying Bradley's arrogant tech executive persona. He was no longer a wealthy, brilliant entrepreneur. He was merely a pathetic common criminal headed straight for a cold, concrete federal cell, completely stripped of his unearned power. While the officers aggressively secured the 2 primary targets, I shifted my cold attention to Monica. She was backed tightly into the darkest corner of the formal living room, clutching her expensive designer leather handbag like a completely useless physical shield. The absolute second the heavy steel handcuffs locked securely around her husband's wrists, her entire psychological demeanor drastically shifted. She did not shed a single tear for him. She did not beg the armed police officers to show him any human mercy. She realized with terrifying absolute clarity that the stolen millions were entirely seized by the government, and her luxurious, entitled lifestyle had just violently evaporated into thin air. She stepped completely out of the dark shadows and pointed a shaking, highly accusatory finger directly at Bradley. She screamed loudly at the top of her lungs that she knew absolutely nothing about the forged secondary mortgage documents or the secret offshore Cayman Island accounts. She viciously declared that Bradley had completely lied to her about his fake consulting business and entirely manipulated her innocent trust. Bradley twisted his bruised face around, looking up at his angry wife with a deeply pathetic expression of absolute betrayal. He weakly begged her to immediately call a high-priced criminal defense attorney to bail him out. Monica simply laughed, a cold, harsh, and utterly ruthless sound that perfectly mirrored the cruel laugh Patricia had used in the freezing rain just 1 week ago. She looked directly into his terrified, desperate eyes and told him she was immediately filing for a ruthless divorce. She boldly promised to take every single clean financial asset left in her personal name. She stepped right over his expensive ruined leather shoes, aggressively pushed her way past the armed federal agents, and marched straight out the front door without looking back a single time. Her instant, brutal abandonment was the absolute final devastating blow, completely severing Bradley from the very last shred of his false wealthy reality. The morning after the arrests, I walked into the downtown offices of the most ruthless real estate law firm in the city. I did not wear the faded oversized jacket anymore. I wore my own tailored charcoal suit, projecting the absolute financial authority I had carefully hidden for an entire week. I sat across from a team of senior attorneys and placed the massive federal dossier directly on their polished conference table. The forged power of attorney and the fraudulent secondary mortgage were completely dismantled within 48 hours. Armed with the undeniable keystroke data and the clear federal indictments, the National Bank immediately voided the illegal loans entirely. They fully restored the original clean title of the sprawling suburban house exclusively into my brother's name. The predatory cash buyer who had cowardly fled into the freezing night was permanently blacklisted from operating in the entire state. Next, I dealt directly with the United States Treasury Department. Special Agent Christopher Cole efficiently processed the seized offshore assets. The millions of dollars Patricia had desperately tried to launder through the fake technology startup were meticulously untangled from the numbered Cayman Island accounts. The federal government officially released the stolen pension funds and the stolen home equity cash directly back to me as Williams' authorized legal proxy. I did not simply return the massive sum of money to a standard vulnerable checking account. I established a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust entirely in Williams' name. I officially appointed Nolan Gallagher as the independent third-party auditor, ensuring that absolutely no one could ever access my brother's wealth without navigating a massive maze of ironclad legal protections. The financial bleeding was permanently stopped. The gaping wounds Patricia had inflicted on his life savings were completely sterilized and securely stitched closed. Every single dollar she had arrogantly spent on luxury sports cars and expensive designer jewelry was forcefully liquidated by the state to fully reimburse the new trust. The absolute restoration of order was a cold, deeply satisfying administrative process. I spent 3 full days aggressively cleaning the infected financial slate. I systematically erased every single trace of their toxic greed from the ledgers, ensuring that when my gentle twin brother finally returned home, he would step directly into an impenetrable fortress of absolute financial security that no greedy relative could ever possibly breach again. 6 months after the federal agents stormed through the front door, the sprawling suburban house finally felt like a genuine home. I stood on the wooden back porch, breathing in the crisp, clean air of a bright spring morning. I heard the sliding glass door open behind me and turned to watch my twin brother step out into the sunlight. The physical transformation William had undergone at my secluded mountain cabin was absolutely miraculous. He had gained back all the healthy weight he had lost during his decades of severe emotional starvation. His spine was perfectly straight, completely cured of the pathetic, defeated hunch Patricia had violently beaten into him. The dark, bruised shadows under his eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a bright, intelligent spark of profound peace. He was finally the dignified, retired teacher he always deserved to be. William walked over to the wooden patio table and handed me a freshly brewed cup of expensive dark roast coffee. In his other hand, he gently held a thick official letter printed on the heavy stationery of the United States District Attorney. He sat down in a comfortable wicker chair, took a slow, appreciative sip of his coffee, and looked out over the meticulously landscaped garden. He did not read the letter out loud because we both already knew exactly what the final typed pages contained. The federal judge had shown absolutely zero leniency toward the massive financial crimes committed against a vulnerable, elderly man. Patricia and Bradley had officially exhausted their final, desperate legal appeals. They were currently beginning their mandatory 20-year sentences in separate maximum security federal penitentiary facilities located hundreds of miles apart. Their luxurious stolen world was permanently replaced by cold steel bars and rigid daily schedules. William looked down at the official federal crest printed on the thick paper and let out a long, quiet sigh. It was not a sigh of bitter, vindictive triumph. It was the deep, profound exhale of a man who had finally dropped an agonizing, crushing weight he had carried for 30 long years. He looked across the table directly into my eyes and quietly thanked me for giving him his entire life back. I raised my coffee mug in a silent, respectful toast to his incredible, enduring strength. The silent adjustment was officially complete. I did not find any dark, joyful thrill in the total destruction of my sister-in-law or my arrogant nephew. I found my absolute reward right here on this quiet, sunlit porch, watching my gentle brother reclaim his stolen dignity. I learned that true family will cross any distance and break any rule to protect you from the monsters hiding in your own home. If you enjoyed this story of absolute restored justice, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Tell me in the comments below what you would have done in my position, and remember to always protect the people you love.